a former president, a gag order, a proposed mistrial, daily press conferences, 10 contempt of court verdicts, 2 gag order hearings, 24-hour news coverage, political punditry, and 34 findings of guilt. This video isn't about any of that. The jury found Trump guilty without knowing any of these sideshows. This video is about the evidence and arguments presented in the courtroom that yielded 34 guilty counts. This is the first video in a 3-part series. Here, I'll lay out the facts of the case from the prosecution's perspective, the defense's evidence and arguments will be in part 2, and the prosecution's rebuttal arguments will be in part 3. The prosecution claim that Michael Cohen, at the direction of Donald Trump, bought the story of adult performer Stormy Daniels related to a 2006 affair she had with Trump. Employees at the Trump organization, at Trump's direction and with Trump's input, then created the plan to pay Cohen back. The execution of this plan created 11 invoices, 12 vouchers, and 11 checks, which had false information, which make up the 34 charges in this case. Other details about past hush money payments, including a conspiracy between Trump, his lawyer Michael Cohen, and National Enquirer editor David Pecker, as well as the testimony of Stormy Daniels, are also included. They were introduced by the prosecution to flesh out the story and prove aspects of the case that were required for Trump's guilt. But before we get to the evidence and arguments, we need to know the law. The specific jury instructions came as a result of a hearing between the prosecution and the defense, which Judge Merchan took into account when writing the final instructions. To find Trump guilty, the prosecution must prove beyond a reasonable doubt, number 1, that on or about February 14th, 2017, in the county of New York and elsewhere, the defendant personally or by acting in concert with another person or persons made or caused a false entry in the business records of an enterprise kept or maintained by the Trump Organization, and number 2, that the defendant did so with intent to defraud that included an intent to commit another crime or aid or conceal the commission thereof. To prove point 1, the prosecution must show beyond a reasonable doubt all of the following: the documents or business records, that they were created on the specific date listed in the jury instructions, an aspect of the record is factually false, and Trump acting with others in the Trump Organization caused the records to be created. The prosecution must also prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump had an intent to defraud and that Trump had an intent to conceal the commission of another crime. There are 34 counts in this case, for the 34 documents involved in Trump repaying Cohen. For every count, every single one of these points needs to be proven to the jury beyond a reasonable doubt. If even one juror finds that one of these factors wasn't proven, there cannot be a guilty verdict on that count. So I would encourage you to look past anything that happened outside of the courtroom, ignore any preconceived biases to either side, and carefully weigh the evidence and arguments to determine whether, in your view, Donald Trump is guilty or not guilty. So join me on this first part of the journey, where we analyse the documents and testimony that the prosecution presented to find the 45th President of the United States guilty of 34 felonies. In this circumstance, building a guilty case is like building a house. There is the foundation, which is necessary before one can construct any walls. In our court analogy, the foundation are the elements of guilt which are not disputed between the prosecution and defense. Both sides largely agree that the 34 business documents exist were created on the specific dates indicated on the documents and that they were created by the Trump Organization. Each of the 4 walls of the building then relate to an element of the case which is in dispute between the 2 sides. They are that the entries in the documents are false, that Trump caused the documents to be created, that Trump had an intent to defraud, and that Trump had the intent to conceal the commission of another crime when he caused them to be created. The prosecution will present the case for each wall and argue that all of the walls are strong and that they can definitely hold the roof of the building. And the defense will argue that the walls are weak and that we can't know beyond a reasonable doubt if they can hold the roof. The jury then needs to inspect the evidence and arguments, and if they find that the walls are of sufficient strength, they will put the roof on and complete the guilty case. However, if they find that even one of the walls wouldn't be able to hold the roof, they can't complete the house, finding Trump not guilty. Starting with the foundation of the building, this one is pretty simple. There are 34 counts, each of which represent a business record that was used by the Trump Organization to repay Michael Cohen. Deborah Tarasoff, who is the accounts payable supervisor at the Trump Organization, attested to their authenticity. There are 11 invoices sent by Michael Cohen, which are then stamped by Deborah Tarasoff. Tarasoff then created 12 vouchers in the MDS system. The MDS system is an internal database that the Trump Organization uses to pay invoices. Ms. Tarasoff created the vouchers for each invoice, with 2 being created for the February invoice, since that month's invoice comprised the January and the February payments. Finally, 11 checks and stubs were created by Ms. Tarasoff, and the first 2 were signed by Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump, with the rest being signed by Donald Trump himself. All these documents also have dates showing when they were created and were kept as business records of the Trump Organization. The prosecution had to prove all of these aspects beyond a reasonable doubt, but it wasn't really disputed in the trial. Now, before we move on to the walls of the house, we first need to talk about the garden. A garden isn't a required part of a house, and the garden plays no part in holding up the roof. Thus, when inspecting individual walls, the jury shouldn't be taking the quality of the garden into account at all. But the garden does influence the character of the home. In this case, the garden is the Stormy Daniels affair. Even if Stormy Daniels was completely lying and made everything up, that doesn't make the payments from Cohen to her legal. And even if everything is completely true and Trump sent goons to threaten her, that doesn't prove his guilt with respect to falsifying documents. But who even is Stormy Daniels? Stormy Daniels has been working in the adult entertainment business since she was 17. She has never worked for either party in the case, but has been involved in several civil lawsuits against Trump. She is appearing in court pursuant to a subpoena issued by the prosecution. But first, a quick explanation. During this video, I will sometimes play voice clips in these colored rectangles. These are directly quoting from the official trial transcript. I use them when the precise wording of the witness could be relevant, as they relate to evidence that is in dispute between the defense and the prosecution. Other times, I will just say that something happened. This is for when the information is not in dispute. So for example, I will play Daniels' quoted testimony about her interactions with Trump, since the sides have a different interpretation of those events, but I'm just going to say that Cohen was Trump's personal attorney, since everyone agrees to that. So, what is Miss Daniels' story?
So, Wicked sponsors one of the holes on the golf course, and we had a table in the gift room where celebrities would come through, get a gift bag, check out the products, pose for photos. You would stay at your hole that had the company's logo, and you would give them water, towels, take a photo. And then later the next day, or whatever, the evening, they would go to the gift rooms. Everybody came through. There were so many photos with the girls, with all the celebrities that came through that day. He did remember us from the golf course. He talked to all of the girls. He remembered me specifically, that I was the smart one. He asked for a DVD. He specifically asked for the one that I had directed. We talked very briefly. Then I saw him talking to his security. And then he said that he came back and said that Mr. Trump would like to know if I would like to have dinner with him.
Did you end up going to his hotel, Mr. Trump's hotel, to have dinner with him?
I did. So I arrived and I went upstairs. The door was actually open, it was cracked open, and his bodyguard, Keith, was standing right outside the double doors to his room. He said, "Hi, nice evening, you look nice," one or two sentences of pleasantries, and said, "Go on in." The door was already open, so I walked on in. He said, "Mr. Trump is there waiting for you." And I called his name, I said hello, and he came from one of the main areas of the hotel suite. You know, when you say hotel room, people often think of a hotel room that we are used to, and when you walk in, there is a bed, a dresser, and that's the connotation that people have in their head when you say a hotel room. This hotel room was 3 times the size of my apartment, and I was sitting directly across from him in the main area, the living room bar area behind me. And he said, "You know, it was a bit early. Would you mind just talking for a bit and get to know each other, and then we can go down or we can stay up or whatever?" I said, "Yes, absolutely." So I took a seat and we started talking. Yeah, I mean, it's getting to know you, it's pleasantries. He was very interested in a lot of the business aspects of it, which I thought was very cool. He showed me a few pictures of things and I said, "Oh, what about your wife?" I actually said, "She is very beautiful. What about your wife?" He said, "Oh, don't worry about that. We don't even sleep in the same room." He would ask me questions and then not let me finish the answer. He kept cutting me off, and it was almost like he wanted to one-up me, which was just really hilarious when you think about it. He just wanted to talk about himself. At this point, I pretty much had enough of his arrogance and cutting me off and still not getting my dinner. So I decided someone should take him on. So I said, "Are you always this rude, arrogant, and pompous? You don't even know how to have a conversion," and I was pretty nasty. I snapped, and he seemed to be taken aback. And I said, "Someone should spank you with that. That's the only interest I have in that magazine, otherwise I am leaving." I don't think he thought I would do it, so he rolled it up and gave me the look that he dared me to do it. So I took it from him and said, "Turn around," and I swatted him.
Where do you swat him?
Right on the butt.
Right after that, did you continue to sit down and talk?
Yes, and he was much more polite.
Did you have a discussion with him about The Apprentice?
He got really quiet and he was thinking, and he told me he had an idea that I should go on his television show. I don't remember the TV show, The Apprentice. I assume it's Celebrity Apprentice. I don't know, The Apprentice. And I said, there is no way NBC would ever let an adult actress on television. And I said, even you don't have that much power. And he said that he did. He said, "You remind me of my daughter because she is smart and blonde and beautiful, and people underestimate her as well. And I am a good writer and director." And he said, "This is your chance to have somebody see that part of you." I was like, "Well, but I'm not a business person. I don't have that kind of education. There is no way I could win." He said, "You don't have to win. You just have to show who you are." I said, "What if I lose on the first episode?" And then he said, "What if I tell you what the challenges are?"
Approximately how long in total were you talking in the suite with Mr. Trump?
Well, close to 2 hours. It was a long time.
Now, at that point, meaning after all of that discussion that you just described, did you sense any red flags or reason that you were concerned about being there?
No.
At some point, did you need to use the restroom?
I had been there for quite a while. I drank a couple of bottles of water, which is all we were drinking. It was water, and I needed to use the ladies' room. So I asked if that was possible, so I was instructed to go through the living room and to the bedroom and to help myself to the facilities. When I came out of the bathroom, I expected to exit, go around the bed, and back out to where we had been sitting and talking and hopefully say, "Okay, time to go. I have been here for a long time." That was actually when I realized how long I had been there. And when I opened the bathroom door to come out, Mr. Trump had come into the bedroom and was on the bed, basically between myself and the exit.
What was he wearing at the time?
His boxer shorts and t-shirt. At first I was just startled, like jump scare. I wasn't expecting someone to be there, especially minus a lot of clothing. That's when I had that moment where I felt the room spin in slow motion. I felt the blood basically leave my hands and my feet, and almost like if you stand up too fast and everything kind of spinned, that happened too. Then I just thought, oh my God, what did I misread to get here? Because the intention was pretty clear. Somebody stripped down in their underwear and posing on the bed like waiting for you. And I went to step around. I laughed nervously and, tried to make a joke out of it and step around and leave, even though I was moving like I was in a funhouse slow motion. I thought to myself, great, I put myself in this bad situation. Like, what did I do? How did I misread everything? He stood up between me and the door, not in a threatening manner. He didn't come at me. He didn't rush at me. He didn't put his hands on me and nothing like that. I said, "I gotta go." He said, "I thought we were getting somewhere. We were talking, and I thought you were serious about what you wanted. You ever want to get out of that trailer park, basically? I was offended because I never lived in a trailer park. I just think I blacked out. I was not drugged. I never insinuated that I was on drugs. I was not drunk. I never said anything of that sort. I just don't remember.
Did you feel threatened by him?
No, not physically, although I did note there was a bodyguard right outside the door. There was an imbalance of power for sure. He was bigger and blocking the way. But I was not threatened verbally or physically. The next thing I know, I was on the bed, somehow on the opposite side of the bed from where we had been standing. I had my clothes and shoes off. I believe my bra, however, was still on. We were in the missionary position.
Was he wearing a condom?
No.
Did you say anything about it?
No.
Why not?
I didn't say anything at all.
And tell us what you recall about getting dressed.
Sitting on end of the bed, noticing that it was completely dark outside now, and that it was really hard to get my shoes on. My hands were shaking so hard. He said, "We should get together again. We were fantastic together. I want to get you on the show."
Did he express any concern at that point about his wife finding out?
No. I told very few people that we had actually had sex because I felt ashamed that I didn't stop it, that I didn't say no. The next day I met him, this time at my hotel, nightclub, restaurant, bar downstairs. They did a silent auction. They had cocktails, however, whatever. I met him at one of the nightclubs there. He was sitting at a booth in a nightclub. Then he said he did come back to me. "Hey, everything about our idea, I think it's good. I got to get back home and figure out how to get you on the show."
Did Mr. Trump call you after that encounter in July of 2006 in Tahoe?
He would call on average once a week, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes not at all for 3 weeks. He would always call. He always definitely loaded the call with an update or a non-update if he didn't have one for The Apprentice, and always talked about when we could get together again. Did I miss him? He always called me Honey Bunch. My publicist thought it was good to continue my conversations with him about the television show. He would call from a New York number, or from Keith's number and or Rona's number, I guess, and said he was going to be in LA. He had the final information almost all sorted out for the show. Would I meet him again for dinner at his bungalow, the Beverly Hills Hotel?
And tell us a little bit about what you discussed with him in the bungalow.
He kept trying to make sexual advances, putting his hand on my leg, scooting closer, giving me compliments.
What was your response?
I told him I was on my period.
Was there more discussion about The Apprentice?
Yes, but a lot less than I thought there would be. No real update.
And about how long did you stay?
2 hours tops. More than an hour, less than 2.
Did you have an experience in about June of 2011 with an encounter in a parking lot in Las Vegas?
My daughter and I went to postpartum, like a workout for a mommy and me workout thing, and I was approached by a man in the parking lot in Las Vegas, in the center of a shopping center that the class was located in. And I thought he was the father or the husband of one of the other women in the class. And he approached me and said that he threatened me not to continue to tell my story.
Did you tell the police at the time?
No.
Why not?
Because he told me not to say anything at all. And I was scared. And I didn't want more of the story coming out.
Now, let me direct your attention to about October of 2011. Did you become aware at around that time that an article had come out and been posted online about your encounter with Mr. Trump on a site called thedirty.com?
Yes, Gina called and told me.
Were you concerned about it being up at the time?
Yes, because I had been threatened, and I didn't want the person who threatened me and my baby thinking I had done it.
Now, I'd like to direct your attention now to 2015. Were you aware at some point that Mr. Trump announced that he was running for president?
Yes.
Did you have a conversation with a friend of yours who is an attorney?
Yes, he helped me set up a press conference that we didn't end up doing.
Did your conversation with him and what happened to you in the parking lot in Las Vegas in 2011 guide your decision about telling your story as a way to make sure that it was documented and out there?
Yes.
Did you decide to let Gina try to sell your story to some news outlets?
Yes.
Did you have any intention of approaching either Mr. Trump or Michael Cohen, his attorney, to have them pay for your story?
No, my motivation wasn't money. It's to get the story out.
Did there come a time that you learned in approximately October of 2016 that Donald Trump and Michael Cohen were interested in buying the rights to your account?
Yes. They were interested in paying for the story, which was the best thing that could happen because then my husband wouldn't find out. But there was still a documentation of a money exchange and a paperwork exchange so that I would be safe and the story wouldn't come out.
Were you told by Ms. Rodriguez how much in total would be paid from Donald Trump and Michael Cohen to purchase the rights to your story?
$130,000.
And how did you feel about that $130,000 at the time?
Didn't care. I didn't care about the amount. It was just to get it done.
Did you express dissatisfaction and want this signed and done by October 14th?
Absolutely.
Why was that?
Because I was afraid that if it wasn't done before the nomination and things, that I wouldn't be safe, or that he would never pay, and there wouldn't be a trail to keep me safe.
What did you understand at this point about what the general terms were of this agreement?
So that in exchange for the sum of $130,000, that I could not tell my story, that he also couldn't tell the story. We could not contact each other or each other's families or representatives. We had to pretend like we didn't know each other at all. If I spoke, it was like $1 million every time I said something.
Obviously, that was just some of Miss Daniels' story related to meeting Donald Trump and signing the NDA. There were some serious limitations the judge put on what the prosecution was allowed to ask her, in particular around the sexual act itself. The defense chose to elicit some more testimony from her about that.
And according to you, when you saw him sitting on the bed, you became faint, the room started to spin, and the blood left your hands and feet, yes?
Yes, it was shock, surprise.
And that made you feel like you were going to faint?
Absolutely. If I came out of the bathroom and saw an older man in his underwear that I wasn't expecting seeing there, yeah.
This was not the first time in your life someone had made a pass at you, was it?
No.
But it was the first time that they had a bodyguard standing outside the door and they were in their underwear.
Okay.
And they were twice my age and bigger than me. But he did stand up, and he was between me and the door, and Keith was outside the door, and then I don't remember. And then I remember we were kissing, and he was on top of me.
But you blacked out, right?
I got lightheaded. I never blacked out. I didn't, hit the floor. Everything spun and went black. But no, I was not given any drugs. I did not take any drugs. And I don't even believe there was alcohol in the room.
Now, obviously, that was just the prosecution side of what happened, and there will be more about how the defense worked to undermine that story in the next part. It's worth keeping in mind that in this case, technically, the accuracy of what Daniels said doesn't particularly matter, but it can be used by the jury when weighing other evidence, and Daniels' credibility is relevant for other parts of her testimony, which go towards actually proving relevant parts of Trump's guilt. So, now that's all out of the way, let's return to our humble abode. And we are actually going to start with the fourth wall first. For this wall, the prosecution needs to prove that Trump had the intent to conceal another crime when causing the creation of the 34 documents. That crime is a violation of Section 17-152 of New York election law, which provides that any two or more persons who conspire to promote or prevent the election of any person to a public office by unlawful means in which conspiracy is acted upon by one or more parties thereto shall be guilty of conspiracy to promote or prevent an election. Knowledge of a conspiracy does not by itself make the defendant a co-conspirator. The defendant must intend that conduct be performed that would promote or prevent the election of a person to public office by unlawful means. We will get to the illegal means of the conspiracy later, but first, let's learn about the players in the conspiracy that the prosecution alleges. Michael Cohen worked as Trump's personal attorney at the Trump Organization from 2007 to 2016, and was thereafter the personal attorney to the president until 2018. He pleaded guilty to 5 counts of tax evasion, 1 count of false statements to a financial institution, 1 count of violating the FECA with a corporate contribution to a campaign, and 1 count of excessive campaign contribution. All those charges are related to his conduct in the events of this case. He also pleaded guilty to lying to the Senate and House Intelligence Committees related to his work on Trump Tower Moscow. He served a little over a year in prison for all of these and did not receive a decrease in his sentence for his testimony in this case. He is testifying due to a subpoena issued by the prosecution. The other man at the core of the conspiracy is David Pecker. He worked as the chairman, president, and CRO of AMI, which is the owner of the National Enquirer, some other tabloids, and many fitness magazines. He has never worked for Donald Trump or the Trump Organization, but they've been friends for many years and worked informally regarding news stories about Trump. He is testifying pursuant to a subpoena issued by the prosecution. The premise of the conspiracy is that Trump, Pecker, and Cohen had a meeting in 2015, just after Trump announced his presidential campaign. At that meeting, Pecker agreed to use the National Enquirer to write positive stories about Trump and report any negative stories he hears to Michael Cohen. Those stories could then be caught and killed, meaning that the rights to the stories can be bought and then not published. This would ensure that details stay private, since the source could not give them to another news organization since they'd already sold the rights. There are 7 major parts of this conspiracy, which were central to this case. There was a meeting between Trump, Cohen, and Pecker, where Pecker agreed to use his position at AMI to help the Trump campaign. Multiple positive stories were written about Trump, and several negative stories were written about Trump's opponents. Pecker did a catch and kill on a story about Trump fathering an illegitimate child. Pecker did a catch and kill on a story about a year-long relationship between Trump and former Playboy model Karen MacDougal. There was a plan to sell the Karen MacDougal story from Pecker to Trump, along with a folder of other negative stories about Trump. Finally, Michael Cohen did a catch and kill on the Stormy Daniels story, which was just described. But obviously, the prosecution can't just say that it happened, they have to prove it using evidence. So, we're going to go through each of these claims and show the most important evidence that was presented to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. The first part is related to the meeting. Here's how Pecker describes it.
And who was present for that meeting?
Donald Trump, Michael Cohen, and Hope Hicks. At that meeting, Donald Trump and Michael, they asked me what can I do and what my magazines could do to help the campaign. So thinking about it, as I did previously, I said what I would do is I would run or publish positive stories about Mr. Trump, and I would publish negative stories about his opponents. And I said that I would also be the eyes and ears of I said I would be your eyes and ears, because I know that the Trump organization had a very small staff. And then I said that anything that I hear in the marketplace, if I hear anything negative about yourself, or if I hear anything about women selling stories, I would notify Michael Cohen. As I did over the last several years, I would notify Michael Cohen. And then he would be able to have them kill in another magazine, or have them not be published, or somebody would have to purchase them.
Michael Cohen describes what was discussed at the meeting in a very similar way.
What was discussed was the power of the National Enquirer in terms of being located at the cash register of so many supermarkets and bodegas, that if we can place positive stories about Mr. Trump, that would be beneficial. That if we could place negative stories about some of the other candidates, that would also be beneficial.
Was there anything else that Mr. Pecker said he could also do for Mr. Trump's candidacy?
Yeah.
What in substance did he say?
What he said was that he could keep an eye out for anything negative about Mr. Trump, and that he would be able to help us to know in advance what was coming out and try to stop it from coming out.
And who did he say he would get in touch with if he was able to identify those types of stories?
The answer was me, Mr. Trump also. Knowing my relationship with David, the two of you should work together, and anything negative that comes, you let Michael know and we'll handle it.
As you may have noticed, Pecker said that Hope Hicks was also at the meeting. He later added that Hope Hicks was in and out of the meeting. Here is her recollection of the events.
You testified earlier that as part of your job, you were sometimes in and out of Mr. Trump's office when he was having other meetings. Is that right?
Yes.
Were you ever in and out of his office when Mr. Pecker was meeting with Mr. Trump in Trump Tower?
I don't have a recollection of that, but it's certainly possible.
You have seen him in Trump Tower before, Mr. Pecker?
Yes.
So, while this does not directly corroborate the meeting or the conspiracy, it is some evidence from a source who is not a member of the conspiracy. But who even is Hope Hicks? Hope Hicks started working for the Trump Organization in 2014 as a director of communications and worked for the Trump campaign before following him into the White House, where she was the communications director and later the counselor to the president. She now does consulting work and hasn't communicated with Trump since 2022. She was subpoenaed by the prosecution and is paying for her own lawyer. Moving on to the next part of the conspiracy, which is the positive stories about Trump and the negative stories about Trump's opponents, which were published in the National Enquirer as a result of this scheme. There were many positive stories, including that he was endorsed by JFK's secret son and Obama's half-brother. On the negative stories side, we have stories panning Ben Carson's surgery ability, labeling him Ben the Butcher. Ted Cruz was accused of having 5 mistresses and his father being involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. Marco Rubio was accused of having an illegitimate child and a cocaine addiction. David Pecker would describe Cohen's direct involvement in creating these negative stories.
My conversations with Michael Cohen would call me and say, we would like for you to run a negative article on, let's say for argument's sake, on Ted Cruz. Then he would send me, he being Michael Cohen, would send me information about Ted Cruz, or about Ben Carson, or about Marco Rubio. That was the basis of our story, and then we would embellish it from there.
Cohen would then show the stories to Trump.
Did AMI sometimes send over the covers of some of these stories to you before they ran them?
Yes.
And what did you do with that material when they sent it over to you?
Immediately showed it to Mr. Trump.
And for what purpose did you show it to Mr. Trump?
So that he knew that David was loyal, was on board, was doing everything that he said he was going to do in that August meeting, and was actually doing it.
And do you recall from time to time when you showed Mr. Trump some of those stories what in general, his reactions were?
That's fantastic. That's unbelievable.
Finally, Hope Hicks would describe the calls she overheard of Trump praising the negative stories.
One of them was, I think, shortly after the National Enquirer published a piece about Ben Carson, and I just overheard a conversation between Mr. Trump and Mr. Pecker, who was on speakerphone, and Mr. Trump was congratulating him on the great reporting.
What was the article about Dr. Carson about?
Medical malpractice.
Did you hear Mr. Trump say anything in particular on this phone call with Mr. Pecker?
I think he was just congratulating David on a great investigative piece. You know, sometimes he would say things like, "This is Pulitzer-worthy." I kind of recall vaguely that is something that he said.
Was that the only time you heard or were present for a phone call between Mr. Trump and Mr. Pecker in this time period?
It's the most vivid recollection of everything I have. I think a similar conversation took place sometime a few months later, also just praising some of the reporting that the National Enquirer was doing. I think maybe around the time there was a story about Ted Cruz.
The next section of evidence related to the conspiracy is Pecker and AMI buying the story of Trump Tower doorman Dino Sajuden. Sajuden claimed that Trump fathered an illegitimate child with a maid that worked at Trump's penthouse. Both the prosecution and the defense agree that the story is factually false. However, the catch and kill of the story by AMI goes towards the conspiracy to influence the election. Before we get into the evidence, we have to bring up the last key player in the conspiracy. Dylan Howard does not get his own profile in the key witnesses section, since he didn't testify due to not being able to travel from Australia because of poor health. He was the editor-in-chief at the National Enquirer, and Pecker immediately informed him about the plan right after the meeting in Trump Tower. Pecker told Howard to vet any stories he hears about Trump and then bring them to him, and he would then inform Michael Cohen. For the Sajuden story, it was Howard who heard about it and brought it to Pecker, who then pushed it forward to Cohen. AMI then purchased the story. Even after Pecker had it confirmed that the story was false, he bought it anyway, since it was very damaging for Trump's campaign.
I asked Dylan to negotiate a price, to negotiate a number, a price to buy the story and take it off the market.
Did you discuss the purchase of the story with Michael Cohen?
I called Michael Cohen up. And I said that we have to go forward with the story. He said, "How much?" I said, "Dylan negotiated a price of $30,000. So he said, "Who's going to pay for it?" So I said, "I'll pay for it. This can be a very big story. I believe it's important that it should be removed from the market. So we'll acquire the story." He thanked me, and he said that the boss would be very pleased.
Who did you understand the boss to be?
The boss would be Donald Trump.
Pecker also believes that Cohen informed Trump about the story.
Because there was a second conversation after that, where he called and said that the story is absolutely not true. He said that Mr. Trump would take a DNA test, that he is German-Irish, and this woman is Hispanic, and it's absolutely impossible.
Cohen also corroborates Trump's involvement.
Well, I went to him immediately to advise him that there was a story, because it was a negative story for him, and to get his direction on what he wanted me to do. He told me to make sure that this story doesn't get out. You handle it.
And as the matter progressed and you got updates from Dylan Howard or David Pecker, did you update Mr. Trump about the matter?
Immediately.
Cohen even personally made alterations to the final agreement to better protect Trump.
I thought that there needed to be a clause in there, a significant penalty for $1 million per violation of any of the terms of the agreement to ensure that the doorman knew not to go ahead and to talk about this matter. What I found was that the agreement had what I considered to be an end date to, and so rather I said, why not just, let's make this in perpetuity.
Finally, we have the contract itself, including the amendment agreement, which shows the changes Cohen suggested. The next catch and kill story was related to Karen MacDougal. Howard informed Pecker about a Playboy model in California who claimed to have had a year-long relationship with Trump. He then called Cohen and they agreed to vet the story. Cohen now spoke to Trump about the story.
I told him about what I had just learned. I asked him if he knew who Karen MacDougal was, if he knows anything about the story. His response to me was, she's really beautiful. Said, okay, but there is a story that's right now being shopped.
What did he ask you in general to do?
Make sure it doesn't get released.
Howard had a meeting with MacDougal and her attorney Keith Davidson and found that while she didn't have any corroborating evidence, he thought the story was true. Later, Trump called Pecker directly.
When I got on the phone, Mr. Trump said to me, I spoke to Michael. Karen is a nice girl. Is it true that a Mexican group is looking to buy her story for $8 million? I said, I absolutely don't believe that there is a Mexican group out there to buy a story for $8 million. And then he said, what do you think I should do? I said, I think you should buy the story and take it off the market. He said to me clearly that he doesn't buy stories because it always gets out. And he said to me that Michael Cohen would be calling me. He was going to speak to Michael, and he would be calling me back.
Cohen was in Trump's office during that call and largely corroborated its contents.
He asked him how things were going with the matter, and David said, we have this under control, and we will take care of this.
Was there a discussion on that call about how much might cost to buy this story and who might pay for it?
Yes, ma'am.
Just in substance, what was that conversation?
So David had stated that it's going to cost them $150,000 to control the story, to which Mr. Trump replied, no problem, I will take care of it.
Was there an understanding about who would initially purchase that story?
Yes.
And who was discussed on that call that would purchase that story?
AMI was going to lay out the funds, and as Mr. Trump had stated to David, I will take care of it.
And what did you understand that to mean?
He was going to pay it back.
Cohen then later called Pecker.
He said, you should go ahead and buy this story. So I said to him, I'm going to have Dylan Howard negotiate the terms. And then I said, who's going to pay for it? So he said to me, don't worry, I'm your friend. The boss will take care of it.
Who did you understand the boss to be a reference to?
Donald Trump.
So, while there was some disagreement about who said what in which call, they both agree that Donald Trump was the ultimate beneficiary of the deal. Stormy Daniels' lawyer, Keith Davidson, had a similar understanding.
I called him and let him know as a professional courtesy that the deal involving his client had closed. And I told him, as it stated to you and Dylan Howard, that this deal wouldn't have happened without Dylan.
Now, you said that you called Michael Cohen as a professional courtesy because the deal involving his client closed. What client is that?
Donald Trump.
Davidson is a new player in this case. He has his own legal practice where he represents celebrities in civil matters. He has never worked for Donald Trump or the Trump Organization. He is testifying pursuant to a subpoena from the prosecution. Due to testifying at the New York grand jury, he has complete immunity for any involvement in this case. It was understood by both parties that this deal was essentially a catch and kill. They agreed that MacDougal's story would not be published. That was one of the key reasons why MacDougal chose the AMI deal over the alternatives. Davidson had a theory at the time as to why AMI did this.
Did you have an understanding as to why AMI would be purchasing a story that they didn't intend to print?
I think there were two. I think one explanation that was given was that they were trying to build Karen into a brand and didn't want to diminish her reputation. And the second was more of an unspoken understanding that there was a close affiliation between David Pecker and Donald Trump, and that AMI would not run this story or any story related to Karen and Donald Trump, as it would tend to hurt Donald Trump.
When you say hurt Donald Trump, you mean hurt Donald Trump's campaign?
Yes.
This seems to also point towards outside parties being aware of the conspiracy between Pecker, Cohen, and Trump. The final piece of evidence related to this deal is the agreement itself. In exchange for $150,000, AMI would have the rights to the story, MacDougal would appear on 2 AMI fitness covers, and she would pen 25 articles. The next part of the conspiracy involves the plans for Trump to buy MacDougal's life rights, alongside a number of other negative stories which were being stored in a drawer in the AMI offices. Pecker needed to be paid back for the MacDougal deal promptly, since the $150,000 expenditure would be discovered during quarter-end reporting, if not reimbursed. There was also some urgency on Trump's end surrounding the other stories in Pecker's possession.
So David had expressed to me that obviously the relationship with Mr. Trump goes back many, many years, and there is a file drawer, or a locked drawer as he described it, where files that relate to Mr. Trump existed. And at that point in time, David was being considered for the position of CEO at Time Inc. Time magazine. And one of the concerns that I had, that I expressed to Mr. Trump, was if he goes, there is a series of papers there that relate to you. Well, I didn't know what those stories were, and nobody was discussing that with me, but that they would be open for use.
Meaning that other people might get their hands on them?
Yes, because we didn't know who the potential CEO or replacement would be.
Pecker backs up that the files were important to Cohen and that he wanted to purchase them.
In September, Michael Cohen said that Mr. Trump wants to acquire the lifetime rights of the Karen MacDougal story, and I should assign the contract over to him. When I say over to Michael Cohen and I would be reimbursed, the company would be reimbursed. And he also added on that Mr. Trump wanted all of the content that the National Enquirer had or developed and retained on Mr. Trump. I told Michael that, these are old files and boxes that are in Florida. The company has been moved to New York City, and there is nothing in those boxes but old news articles, magazine articles, old files. He insisted that he wanted those boxes, and he wanted the content.
To convince Pecker that he would indeed get paid back, Cohen recorded a meeting between himself and Trump on his phone.
I need to open up a company for the transfer of all of that info regarding our friend David, so that I'm going to do that right away. I've actually come up and I've spoken to Alan Weisselberg about how to set the whole thing up with funding. Yes. And it's all the stuff, because you never know where that company, you never know where he's going to be. Correct. So I'm all over that, and I spoke to Alan about it when it comes time for the financing, which will be.
Listen, what financing?
We'll have to pay you. So no. I got no. Hey, Don, how are you?
So Cohen and Pecker work on creating an agreement to exchange the stories for funds. The final agreement can be seen here. Cohen set up the company Resolution Consultants to create apparent separation from Trump. The final deal turned out to be $125,000, since AMI valued the MacDougal magazine covers and articles at $25,000. However, the deal ended up falling through. After talking to his lawyer, Pecker called off the deal. He goes on to describe a conversation with Cohen, informing him the deal was cancelled.
I called Michael Cohen and I said to him that the assignment deal is off. I am not going forward. It is a bad idea, and I want you to rip up the agreement. He was very, very angry, very upset, screaming basically at me. Michael Cohen said, "The boss is going to be very angry at you." I said, "I am sorry, I am not going forward. The deal is off." And he said, "I can't believe it. I am a lawyer. I am your friend. I don't understand why you are so concerned." I said, "I am very concerned, and I am not going forward, period." And I said, "Are you going to rip it up or not?" And he said, "I will take care of it."
Cohen had a different recollection of why the deal fell through.
David Pecker contacted me and stated that it was no longer necessary to have Mr. Trump pay the $125,000. I asked him why. Satisfied, because now I would report to Mr. Trump that he wouldn't have to pay that amount of money, which would make him happy. And the reason was because the Karen MacDougal front cover on Men's Health magazine had sold more copies than they had not only anticipated, I think that they had ever. The way David expressed it to me, that they had ever sold and they had made a lot of money on that. and that it was no longer necessary because he didn't need to bury the $125,000. He also then had a second cover to use MacDougal on, as well as the 24 additional articles that she was. That was going to be penned with her name on it. So he felt that it was, even for the $150,000, it was an excellent business deal.
And what was Mr. Trump's reaction?
It was great. He doesn't have to pay $125,000 or $150,000.
While these differences do matter in terms of determining the credibility of the statements, and obviously it looks much better for Trump if the agreement fell through because AMI made so much money that it wasn't necessary to get paid back, as opposed to Pecker's lawyers encouraging him to cancel the agreement. Either way, the transfer agreement could go towards conduct to promote the conspiracy between Cohen, Pecker, and Trump. The final part of the conspiracy that I'm going to include as part of this wall is the purchase of the Stormy Daniels story by Michael Cohen. The reason that this is part of the conspiracy involving David Pecker and AMI is due to their participation in finding and negotiating the deal, even if they weren't the source of the funds this time. It was Dylan Howard who was offered the story.
And I received an urgent call from Dylan Howard. And Dylan said that he received a call from his two best sources, Keith Davidson, who we know is the attorney for Karen MacDougal, and this other source, Gina Rodriguez, who is an agent for those type of celebrities. He said that she, being Stormy Daniels, is trying to sell a story that she had a sexual relationship with Donald Trump, and Dylan can acquire the story for $120,000 from Keith Davidson if we make the decision right now.
After Pecker decides not to buy this story, Howard instead brings it to Cohen.
So the Access Hollywood tape dropped. Gina and Dylan came to terms at $120,000. Dylan backed out, which left that deal up in the air. AMI did not want to complete the deal, or would not complete the deal, and Dylan asked Gina to call Cohen and close the deal with him.
Cohen essentially accepts the deal, but at Trump's command, he starts stalling to try and make it past the election without paying the hush money. After the election, he would cancel the deal. Davidson and Daniels see through this and void the agreement and prepare to give an interview to the Daily Mail. Howard and Pecker manage to get the deal back on and have a call with Cohen.
Well, it was all about, again, the resolution of the non-disclosure agreement.
And what, if anything, was Dylan Howard telling you on that phone call?
How to get this thing done. She's going to the Daily Mail. This could be catastrophic to the campaign. This will further isolate women from the candidate.
And did you make a request at that time of Mr. Pecker on that call?
If he would be kind enough to make the payment.
Why did you ask him to make the payment at that point?
To see if he would do it, considering he's been doing it for Mr. Trump before. I figured, why not ask?
What did he say?
Not a chance.
Pecker finally gives some advice to Cohen.
I said, Michael, my suggestion to you, you should buy the story. You should take it off the market because if you don't, and it gets out, I believe the boss will be very angry with you.
As it turns out, Cohen did heed that advice and bought the story shortly thereafter. That concludes the main bits of evidence that are presented by the prosecution to prove that there was a conspiracy. To finish with the narrative of events, we still need to go over how Cohen bought the story and how Trump repaid him. To do that, we're going to head to wall number 1. For this wall, the prosecution needs to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the entries in the business records are false. They posit that the payments were in large part a repayment for a $130,000 purchase of the Stormy Daniels story. Michael Cohen says that he bought the story at the direction of Donald Trump with an expectation of getting paid back. He took $130,000 out of a home equity line of credit so his wife wouldn't find out, and funded the shell company, Essential Consultants, who then paid Daniels. There was a side letter agreement held only by Cohen which identified the parties. This way, even if the contract were to leak, Trump would not be connected to it. Later that year, Trump won the election, becoming the 45th president of the United States. It was a transition period as Trump was moving away from the Trump Organization to his new home in Washington, D.C. Cohen was already perturbed due to not being paid back for the Daniels deal and was furious when his end-of-year bonus was cut. Cohen was particularly offended by this due to all the work he had done to get Trump elected. In particular, he had spent $130,000 of his own money to protect Trump. Even Trump's closest ally and Trump Organization CFO Alan Weisselberg had refused to go that far. So Cohen went to Weisselberg and informed him of how annoyed he was. Weisselberg assured Cohen that he would be made whole, and later, Trump called Cohen from Florida to tell him he would be taken care of. The repayment of Cohen, in particular the 34 financial documents, are at the core of this case. The prosecution needs to prove that these are false, and the key way they do this is by identifying the false entries in each document. For the 11 invoices, they all say they are for services rendered. The 12 vouchers all mention a retainer agreement and say that they are legal expenses, and 11 check stubs say they are related to a retainer agreement. All of these are false, since they were a reimbursement to Michael Cohen. If the prosecution can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it was a reimbursement, then this wall is solid. The key documents that prove that these are reimbursements are Exhibits 35 and 36. People's 35 is a print-off of the bank statement that shows the $130,000 payment to Daniels. Cohen printed it off as proof to show Weisselberg. In a meeting between Cohen and Weisselberg, writing was added to the bottom of the page. On the bottom right, Cohen added $50,000 to the $130,000, summing the total to $180,000. The $50,000 was another reimbursement to Cohen, after he'd paid consulting company Red Finch for some work they had done for Trump. On the left-hand side, Weisselberg takes the $180,000 and grosses it up, meaning he doubles it for taxes. He then adds $60,000, which was to make up for the cut bonus. Total repayment to Cohen thus amounted to $420,000. Cohen says that he went with Weisselberg to Trump's office, who insisted that the payback be split into monthly payments and take place over the course of a year, whereupon Weisselberg wrote that down at the bottom of the page. Weisselberg then went to Trump Organization Senior Vice President Controller Jeffrey McConney. McConney took notes on his Trump Organization notepad during the meeting, which is now Exhibit 36. McConney incorrectly wrote down $50,000 for the bonus instead of $60,000, but Weisselberg corrected this when it came to the final sum. The note also includes the $180,000 reimbursement, and this one explicitly says ×2 for taxes. These documents at face value clearly show that Cohen was not getting paid for legal services, but was being reimbursed for payments he had made for Donald Trump, one of which was the hush money payment. But there is also other evidence that appeared at the trial that this was a reimbursement. Multiple parties testified that they thought it was a reimbursement. Obviously Cohen said it was.
Well, what was it actually?
Reimbursement of my money. It was a repayment of the Stormy Daniels payment, as well as, again, you had the bonus and then the Red Finch money.
McConney also mentioned that Weisselberg thought it was a repayment.
Alan said we had to get some money to Michael, reimburse Michael.
Before the meeting that yielded the handwritten documents, Cohen also told Davidson that he hadn't been paid back yet, indicating he expected to get paid back.
And then he made reference to, he said, I never even got paid, he said. That fucking guy is not even paying me the $130,000 back.
Cohen also mentioned to Pecker that he hadn't been paid back yet.
Michael said to me that he wasn't reimbursed for the monies owed to him on the Stormy Daniels payment.
And finally, on multiple occasions, Trump has admitted that it was a reimbursement. Firstly, Donald Trump admitted to reimbursing Cohen through a legal filing which was part of a lawsuit with Stormy Daniels. The document itself didn't make it into the trial, but there was this exchange on the redirect with Stormy Daniels after the defense opened the door on cross-examination.
And do you recall that his attorneys, Mr. Trump's attorney in court papers filed in June of 2018, confirmed that Donald Trump in 2017 had reimbursed Michael Cohen's company, Essential Consultants, for the $130,000 that was paid to you?
Yes, I saw that.
So that was confirmed in Mr. Trump lawyers' submitted court papers, correct?
Correct.
The second admission is on a government ethics form. Since Trump was president, he had to fill out certain public financial forms. On page 45 of this document, there is a note which states that, while it is not required reporting, in the interest of transparency, Trump is reporting an expense incurred by Michael Cohen, which was reimbursed in 2017. It also states that the reimbursement amount is between $100,000 and $250,000. Finally, in May 2018, Trump tweeted, stating the monthly retainer Cohen received had nothing to do with the campaign and that it was reimbursement for the NDA with Stormy Daniels. He finishes the tweet thread by saying that money from the campaign or campaign contributions played no role in the transaction. So it seems that Trump, while denying using campaign funds, seems to have admitted that Cohen was paid a reimbursement. That concludes the most important evidence presented by the prosecution that the payment was a reimbursement and thus the entries in the business documents are false. If this evidence proves that beyond a reasonable doubt, then this wall is strong and that component of the case is proven. Next up, we're going to check out wall number 2. For this wall, the prosecution needs to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump acted in concert with others to create false business documents. First, there was some testimony at the trial that stated that Trump knew about or was directly involved in repaying Cohen. Obviously, we have Cohen's testimony. Here, he describes what happened at the meeting with Weisselberg, where the repayment amount was determined.
What did you do, and where did the two of you go at that time?
We went to Mr. Trump's office in order to speak to him about this.
And did he show this document to Mr. Trump?
Yes.
Did Mr. Weisselberg state in front of Mr. Trump that you were going to receive $420,000 over the course of 12 months?
Yes.
And what, if anything, did Mr. Trump say at that time?
He approved it, and he also said, this is going to be one heck of a ride in D.C.
Keith Davidson thought Trump was involved since he was the beneficiary of the agreements.
And did you know when you were dealing with Michael Cohen that you were dealing with Donald Trump?
Yes, I never thought otherwise.
He also felt like Cohen couldn't spend any of Trump's money without Trump's approval.
And then he said, well, goddamn it, what do you expect me to do? My guy is in 5 fucking states today, or 3 or 4 or 5 different states today. There is nothing I can do. I'm doing everything I can.
When he said that his guy was in a certain number of states, who did you understand his guy to be making reference to?
Donald Trump.
And what was the relevance based on your conversation with Michael Cohen about what was the relevance of the fact that Mr. Trump was in 3 or 4 or 5 different states?
To me, it was similar. It's a situation I run into all the time. It was similar to like someone who doesn't have the purse strings. It's like an attorney has to go call an insurance adjuster. Like that. Michael Cohen didn't have the authority to actually spend money despite the fact there has been so many excuses and funding deadlines that have already been missed.
We saw earlier on Wall 4 how both Pecker and Cohen testified that Trump was involved in the conspiracy to catch and kill stories. We also heard some of his involvement on audio tape. Since he was involved in the conspiracy, it makes it more likely that he was involved in the reimbursement and cover-up. Alan Weisselberg is pretty strongly connected to the repayment, given that it's in his handwriting that the repayment amount is calculated on Exhibit 35. Rebecca Minocchio, who is a bookkeeper at the Trump Organization, said that during the time frame when the repayment scheme was created, while Trump was in the office, he met with Weisselberg every day.
And as Mr. Weisselberg's assistant for 8 years, did you become familiar with the people Mr. Weisselberg interacted with at the Trump Organization?
Yes.
When Mr. Trump was in the office, how often would Mr. Weisselberg interact with Mr. Trump?
Every day.
Given that Weisselberg knew about the repayment, he probably would have informed Trump. Rebecca Minocchio is a junior bookkeeper at the Trump Organization. She has been working there for 11 years and she is testifying pursuant to a subpoena from the prosecution. There is also copious amounts of evidence that Trump would keep track of and be involved in everything the Trump Organization did. He writes that in his books. For example, from this chapter, called Pay Attention to Detail, it says, if you don't know every aspect of what you're doing, down to the paper clips, you're setting yourself up for some unwelcome surprises. Pecker supported this and describes Trump as a micromanager.
I would describe Mr. Trump as very knowledgeable. I would describe him as very detail-oriented. I would describe him as almost as a micromanager from what I saw, that he looked at all of the aspects of whatever the issue was.
If you believe that Trump had knowledge and involvement in everything that went on in the Trump Organization, that would go directly towards Trump being involved in the Cohen repayment. The other large pillar that would point towards Trump being involved is the fact that he signed the checks. The Trump Organization was set up so that any expense over $10,000 could only be approved by Trump himself. It is another piece of evidence that Trump was a micromanager, and even after he became president, he didn't change this procedure and still wanted to personally sign the checks from his account. When the last 9 checks to Cohen were issued from the DJT account, Trump had to sign them at the White House. If Trump is a careful person who pays attention to details and he signs the checks without questioning anything, that indicates that he knows why Cohen is getting paid and approves it. We have already established that Pecker thinks Trump is detail-orientated, but Madeleine Westerhout backs it up too.
In general, is he the type of person who would pay attention to details? In my experience, yes. In your experience, did he typically read things before signing them? Yes.
Westerhout worked as Trump's executive assistant at the White House. She is testifying pursuant to a subpoena issued by the prosecution, and her lawyer is taking the case pro bono. Deborah Tarasoff was the person who prepared the 9 checks for Trump to sign. Here is her check preparation method.
Once you cut a check, what would you do with it?
I would cut the check, put it together with the backup, and bring it over to Rona, so she would bring it in to Mr. Trump to sign.
You said put it together with the backup?
The invoice.
Was there ever more than an invoice, or was it usually just an invoice?
Basically, it's just an invoice.
And how would you put the check together with the invoice?
Just put the check on top of the invoice, staple it, and bring it over.
Deborah Tarasoff is an accounts payable supervisor who has been working at the Trump Organization for 24 years. She was subpoenaed by the prosecution, and her attorneys are being paid for by the Trump Organization. Rebecca Minocchio backed this check preparation method up and stated that this procedure was uniform across the Trump Organization.
I put checks with their backup together and gave them to Mr. Weisselberg to sign.
And what do you mean by backup?
The invoice.
Did every check that you put together for Mr. Weisselberg to sign have to have an invoice attached?
Yes.
Do you know if the process was consistent kind of across the Trump Organization for paying expenses?
Yeah.
Finally, Pecker testified that he saw checks prepared this way.
I had a meeting with Mr. Trump in his office, and when I was there, his assistant Rona brought in a batch of invoices and checks to sign. And I observed Mr. Trump, he asked me, while he was reviewing the accounts payable packages, we were talking at the same time, and I noticed that he reviewed the invoice and looked at the check, and then he was signing them.
Tarasoff also testified to what Trump would do if he didn't like the check or invoice.
What if you cut a check from the DJT account? Did Mr. Trump have to sign the check because Mr. Weisselberg approved it?
No. If he didn't want to sign it, he didn't sign it.
Did you ever see situations where he didn't sign checks?
Yes.
What would happen in those situations?
He would write void on it and send it back.
How do you know he would write void on it?
It was signed in a Sharpie in black. That is what he usually uses.
Madeleine Westerhout also describes what would happen if Trump needed clarification on an issue related to the checks.
Do you remember if Mr. Trump ever had questions about the checks?
I think I remember maybe a couple times him having a question about a check and then calling Alan Weisselberg or somebody else in the Trump Organization to ask for clarification.
Rebecca Minocchio agreed with this point.
And what did she tell you would happen if a check was missing?
If it was missing, either it got lost or he had questions about it and he had to speak to someone.
And when you say he, you are saying?
Mr. Trump.
He might have a question on a check that was found?
Yes.
That is why he didn't send it back up?
Yes.
And if he had questions, what would happen? Would you question him?
No, that's as far as I go.
Would you just wait to get further instructions on what to do, if anything, with the checks?
Yes.
Since Trump signed the 9 checks and didn't call anyone to clarify, he must have known about the repayment scheme, which yielded the 34 false documents. This wall contains the prosecution's evidence that Trump knew about the reimbursement plot. If these facts lead to the conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt that he knew and that he was involved, then this wall is solid. Next up, we get wall number 3, which is where the prosecution needs to prove Trump's intent. The prosecution does not need to prove that there was any premeditation. They just need to show that when Trump caused the false business records to be created, he had the intent of creating false business records. We are instructed to take into account the things that Trump said and did, the results of his actions, and what would have been the probable outcome of his conduct. Lots of previous evidence will also go into proving this wall. We have Cohen's testimony that Trump was involved in creating the repayment scheme and Trump's signing of the checks. We also have the fact that false business records were created and that the plan to repay Cohen while disguising the payments would have to create false business documents. But we also have some other supporting evidence, starting with why Trump instructed Cohen to buy the Daniels story and why he was desperate to cover it up. According to Davidson, Stormy Daniels had actually tried to sell her story back in April, but nobody was particularly interested. However, later, the Access Hollywood tape was released. The judge ruled that hearing the tape in Trump's own voice was unnecessarily prejudicial, so I won't play it here. But the content is basically that Trump claimed to kiss women he had just met and grab them by the genitals. He said that they wouldn't stop him because he was a star. This was a big problem for the campaign. Madeleine Westerhout, who was working at the Republican National Committee at the time, described some of the fallout.
At the time, I recall it rattled the RNC leadership.
Did the RNC leadership consider replacing Mr. Trump as a candidate?
It's my recollection that there were conversations about how to, if it was needed, how it would be possible to replace him as the candidate if it came to that.
The release of the tape was clearly something Trump would have wanted to prevent. At the meeting back in 2015 between Cohen, Pecker and Trump, they mentioned that there would probably be women coming forward and that it would be negative for the campaign. Thus, in large part, the conspiracy, from the start, was about suppressing those stories. Trump also tweeted around this time that he lost a large amount of female voters due to his comments on the tape. In another tweet, he claims that nothing actually happened. This gives an insight into Trump's strategy to defend against the tape. He claimed there was locker room talk and words, not actions.
I've never said I'm a perfect person, nor pretended to be someone that I'm not. I've said and done things I regret, and the words released today on this more than a decade-old video are one of them. Anyone who knows me knows these words don't reflect who I am. I said it, I was wrong, and I apologize. I've traveled the country talking about change for America, but my travels have also changed me. I've spent time with grieving mothers who've lost their children, laid-off workers whose jobs have gone to other countries, and people from all walks of life who just want a better future. I have gotten to know the great people of our country, and I've been humbled by the faith they've placed in me. I pledge to be a better man tomorrow and will never, ever let you down. Let's be honest, we're living in the real world. This is nothing more than a distraction from the important issues we're facing today. We are losing our jobs, we're less safe than we were 8 years ago, and Washington is totally broken. Hillary Clinton and her kind have run our country into the ground. I've said some foolish things, but there's a big difference between the words and actions of other people. Bill Clinton has actually abused women, and Hillary has bullied, attacked, shamed, and intimidated his victims. We will discuss this more in the coming days. See you at the debate on Sunday.
So it was really important for the campaign that no new women's stories came out before the election, since that would undermine the words not actions defense. In fact, Cohen and Pecker took down a past article that alluded to the Daniels affair. It was published in 2011 on the Dirty.com, which had since come under the ownership of AMI. So the prosecution posit that this was the key motive that led to the purchase of the Daniels story and the subsequent reimbursement to Cohen. Cohen could then not get paid back normally, as that might expose the story and the whole catch and kill scheme. Another key factor that shows Trump's intent is the fact that Cohen was paid back double. This was to hide the reason for the reimbursement. Pecker described Trump as a very frugal person.
I thought that his approach to money, he was very cautious and very frugal.
And Jeffrey McConney describes a lesson Trump taught him about haggling and being prudent with money.
Early on, I think I was employed for about a year. President Trump was on the phone. I walked into his office, dropped a report on his desk, turned around, and he said, "Jeff, hold on a minute." Sorry. He said to who he was talking to, the person on the phone, "Hold on a minute," and turned around and said, "Jeff, you're fired," and started talking to the person on the phone again. I stood there until he got off the phone call, and he said, "You're not fired, but my cash balances went down from last week." He said, "I know you negotiated this." He said, "Now focus on my bills." It was a teaching moment. Just because somebody is asking for money, negotiate with them, talk to them. Just don't do it mindlessly. Think before you do it.
Jeffrey McConney is now retired. He worked for the Trump Organization for 39 years, and during the time of the reimbursement was the Senior Vice President Controller. He was called by the prosecution, and his lawyers are being paid for by the Trump Organization. Trump also backs up his diligence with funds in his books. Some extracts from Trump's book, Think Like a Billionaire, were included as evidence. He writes, "Every dollar counts in business, and for that matter, every dime. Penny pinching? You bet. I'm all for it." He also writes an anecdote about how Spy magazine sent checks ranging from 50 cents to $5 to millionaires around the country. He got a check for 50 cents and he cashed it. He also includes the interaction that McConney just described. So then, why would Trump reimburse Cohen double the amount? If he labeled the payment as a reimbursement, Cohen would not have to pay taxes on it, and Trump would not have to double it up. Trump clearly put a high value on disguising the payment. This value is particularly high if we believe the evidence that was just displayed, showing that Trump is usually a penny pincher and doesn't overpay people. Once again, these factors, along with the circumstances of the situation and Trump's actions, which are described on other parts of the House, all contribute towards proving Trump's intent. If we believe that it was proved beyond a reasonable doubt, then Wall 3 is solid. Finally, we get to the last part, which brings us back to Wall 4. We've already gone over the evidence that Trump was involved in a conspiracy to influence the election, but the prosecution needs to prove that the conspiracy involved illegal means. There are 3 different criminal means that are posited. They have all already been brought up, and some of the evidence connecting it to Trump has been shown earlier on this wall. The first is illegal campaign donations. Under the Federal Election Campaign Act, corporations cannot donate directly to campaigns, and individuals can donate a maximum of $2,700. The term donation includes a purchase made for a candidate if the purchase would not have occurred but for the candidate running for office. The prosecution have 2 corporate contributions from AMI, that being the $30,000 purchase of the Sajuden story and the $150,000 purchase of the MacDougal story. They also have 1 private contribution exceeding $2,700. That is the purchase of the Stormy Daniels story by Michael Cohen. If the prosecution has proven that any of these occurred as part of the large conspiracy between Pecker, Trump, and Cohen, and they would not have occurred but for Trump running for president, then Wall 4 is proven. The second illegal means that the prosecution put forward was the violation of tax law. It is illegal to submit false tax returns, even if in the end it doesn't result in any underpayment of tax. There are 2 false tax forms, one related to the payment of Cohen from the revocable trust account and one from the DJT account. They list it as non-employee compensation and have Cohen pay tax on it. These are false tax returns as the payments are reimbursements for the Daniels purchase and Cohen should not pay any tax on that. The final legal means is the falsification of business records. This is similar to the main charges in the case, but they are for different documents than the core 34. These documents all came as a result of different parts of the conspiracy. These were the shell companies that Cohen set up to first buy the MacDougal story from AMI and then eventually purchase the Daniels NDA. These documents are false, as it states that the companies were set up as consulting companies, which is untrue since they are meant to be used to disguise Trump buying women's stories. Cohen actually explicitly said that he called them consulting companies because he thought the bank would reject them if their true purpose was listed. The next ones are the documents associated with Cohen's wire transfer from Essential Consultants to Keith Davidson. Of note is that Cohen lists the purpose of the wire as being for a retainer. This is not true, as it was a payment for an NDA. Next up, we have the invoice that AMI sent from Investor Advisory Services to Resolution Consultants LLC for Trump to reimburse AMI for buying the MacDougal story. Once again, the purpose of the transfer is false, as it states that it is an agreed upon flat fee for advisory services, when it was in fact to buy the rights to the MacDougal story and other stories about Trump. The final false business documents are actually some we saw very recently. They are the 1099 tax forms issued by the Trump Organization to Michael Cohen. Apparently, they are not just a violation of tax law, they are also false business documents. This makes sense, since them being false is what causes them to be a violation of tax law in the first place. If it is proven beyond a reasonable doubt that any one of these documents is false, was created as part of the conspiracy to influence the election, and that Trump had an intent to create it, then this section is solid. So those are the 3 illegal means that the prosecution put forward. Now how this works is that each juror just needs to find that one of these was proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Jurors can also disagree on which one was proven, as long as they all agree that at least one was proven. So for example, one juror could determine that the election donations was proven, but the other ones were in some way insufficient, and a second juror could come along and say that the violation of tax law was strong, but the other ones were just totally made up in some way. Both jurors would determine that this was solid, even though they disagree on the underlying facts of what was shown. So, that concludes part 1 of the series. That's the basic evidence put forward by the prosecution to find Trump guilty. What do you think? Do you think the prosecution have a solid case? Or are they missing some key aspects for you? Whatever your opinion, remember that you've only heard from one side so far, and in the next part of the series, the defense gets to strike back.